All right.
Cool. Welcome. My name's Rachel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here on behalf of the Alder Commons organizing team, and we're thrilled to have Leon Smith here sharing about how to use willows in the Playscape. Yay! Welcome, Leon.
Hi, everybody. Um, Before I introduce things and get rolling here, I just want to say this can be more conversational necessary than a lecture. I've got a lot of pictures to share, but I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas, comments, criticisms. So feel free to holler them out at me.
Are you having fun, Daphne? Right.
On cue. So I have been working with Willow. For me, my journey with Willow is very much been alongside of my work with play environments. And I started out on that road as a preschool teacher in 2000, did a few years of that while I was in college. Also started designing playgrounds at the child care center where I worked. And on that project, I did my first living willow structure. So my work with willows is all in the context of creating play environments for kids. I'm really excited to share some pictures with you all and to talk about this wonderful plant, ally. But I always like to start thinking about, where did you love to play as a kid? I don't know if we have time to go around and hear from everybody today, but if anybody is inspired to speak up and share the memory of where you played as a kid, now's a good time to do it.
Outside and in places I wasn't supposed to be.
Nice. Thanks, Carl. Anybody else?
My grandparents had a lot of land where they lived on the East Coast, and it was just forest and fields. And my favorite places were climbing trees and exploring creeks and that sort of thing.
Nice. Climbing trees, exploring creeks.
We had a little grove of trees next to our driveway, and there was a big flat rock under there that seemed like a table to me. And so that seemed like a fun place to play.
You have the big rock under the tree. Awesome. Well, thank you all. I love to hear those stories. This is something that I ask whenever I do any kind of talk around something related to kids' environments, because I think it's important for us to remember these things and remember the feelings that we had playing in these kinds of environments, because I think that empowers us to make good decisions when we're talking about creating environments for kids today, or grown-ups for that matter. Hi, Brian. So when I ask that question, I hear lots of folks talk about wild places. All of us didn't grow up with access to those kinds of places, but when we did, those are often always rise to the surface of being those places we remember loving to play. Folks, a lot of people talk about climbing in trees, cozy hideouts underneath shrubbery, forts, hidden spaces, small nooks. Places that we created for ourselves, just using whatever kind of scrap materials were available. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to explain why this whole work with Willow occurs within the framework of what we call nature play, or natural playgrounds, natural playscapes, which is where I did the majority of my work within this kind of framework, which is essentially bringing nature into the kind of controlled environments where kids spend a lot of time in schools and preschools. And I'm just going to go through a little bit of the reasons why we do that. I mean, it seems kind of intuitively obvious for a lot of people, but there's good science behind it as well. So kids, when they have some kind of contact with nature throughout the day, just do better in school generally, but specifically better concentration, better self-discipline. It's especially helpful for kids who struggle with attention issues, and those can be ameliorated after periods of time in natural settings. Generally, kids who get to spend time in natural environments, and again, these don't have to be like wild nature. This could be backyards, it can be, you know, abandoned lots, it can be even alleyways. I have a wildness to them. But they include complex terrain that where we practice balance, coordination, agility, and then being exposed to the microbiology of being outdoors, you know, in the dirt and elsewhere. It strengthens our immune system as well. Also developing the kind of pre-academic skills. I don't know why I say pre-academic. Really, it's all learning. Like playing in nature is building up a strong base from which to continue learning into your life. These are some interesting social kinds of experiments where you take a group of kids playing on a conventional playground environment and then the same group of kids in a nature setting, and they see less incidents of negative social play or bullying in the nature setting and more positive incidents of social interactions with a given group of kids over a given period of time. They're having more conversations with each other in a natural setting than in a conventional playground setting, for example. So there's something magic about that. And then the more kind of ethereal qualities that they're developing are sense of imagination, sense of wonder, connection with nature, curiosity about the world, first interactions with other living things. So this is the framework within that you know leads me to think of Willow as a wonderful ally. And the Willow work goes out beyond this work of play environments, but this is where it starts for me. So in natural playscapes, we think about all different kinds of plants that we might bring in for kids to engage with. And we think about plants, especially in terms of their sensory qualities, touch, smell, taste, the kinds of spaces that they frame, that they create, the ways kids can engage with them. You know, when we create natural playscapes, it's not to have a museum of nature that kids aren't allowed to really touch. It's really to have it be full on. And that means that, you know, leaves get picked and branches get broken, and Willow is one of those plants that's really hardy and resilient to that kind of kid abuse. So it makes it a wonderful plant for the playground. Connecting with food and how we get all of our food from nature in one way or the other. Sense of mystery and exploration. One of my kind of, you know, pet campaigns is to redeem in the eyes of especially of schools, but anyone in general, the lowly dandelion, which is a wonderful plant for play. It is totally edible, all parts of the plant. It's colorful, goes through the wonderful life cycle that's kind of magical in the minds of kids and adults alike. You can pick it all day and there's still going to be more of them. So those are some good qualities to have in a plant for play. You think of folks who might not have access to big wild areas. There's a lot of ways you can rewild your yard or your garden and provide interesting playful elements. I really like this mode labyrinth. It's something that anyone who has a lawn can do. When you let plants grow big and wild, then they create little nooks underneath them, behind them. One of the big ideas of the nature-based playground is referring back to all those memories that I heard from you all, of the place we love to play as kids. And, you know, among those are cozy hideouts and plants. It's one of those archetypes that I hear again and again. So overlapping with this can be the idea of play gardens, where you're doing a little bit more intentional cultivation of plants. There might be some food production there as well, but the play value is still kind of front and center. You might be carving into natural hedges, as in this case, where they just trimmed out some of the undergrowth to create a little nook that children could get inside of. And then the idea of intentional creation of structures, huts, forts. You know, these are structures made out of sticks from a site, a campsite in Europe. These are not living structures, but they're still magical nonetheless and created all by kids. Other stick-built structures, but built by children. You know, these are, when I find these kinds of situations, they're often, you know, off to the edges of the site. Like there will be a schoolyard and a playground there, but then just on the edge of the playground in the kind of woody area that people have kind of forgotten about, that's where the real fun stuff happens. Another example of that, like just loose sticks can be a wonderful loose part for creation of spaces. This particular stick creation was at a school that I worked with in Maryland, and it's the name of this is Sticks a Brixen, after the book Rocks a Boxen, if you all are familiar with that classic kids book. But Sticks a Brixen was a stick village created by kids, and it had been created by, you know, one generation of kids, made, you know, 3 or 4 years prior to when I visited it, and it got kind of passed down and evolved over the generations of kids as they passed through the school. And the culture of kids play had developed there to the point where there was, you know, rules of the community. There was a mayor, there was a kind of real estate sale that happened of the different stick structures, and a currency of little white pebbles that they would find on the ground. And you know, some kinds of like building codes around the type of your stick structure. So when allowed to develop, kids' culture is incredibly creative and generative and magical. You know, other structures built by children with the help of adults. You know, we aren't getting into the living structures yet, but there's so much you can do with just the sticks. So this is a school in Germany that we visited where there was an abundance of sticks because they had some willow. And one of the things we'll talk about with willow is that it's prolific and it produces lots of shoots, new shoots every year, especially if you are in the habit of coppicing it or cutting it back. And they were using these cuttings in an art project where the kids are gathering the sticks together and binding them up with twine. And I seem to be stuck here. I need to, there we go. Okay, into these different forms. And then painting them. So interactive, outdoor, three-dimensional art. And there's a lot of traditional craft work done with willow boughs and the cuttings of lots of other plants as well. I really love this woven fence. This is another public park in Germany. This is woven willow, but non-living, but it was woven while it was still green. This, I believe, is at the Nature Explore site at the Arbor Day Foundation in Nebraska. And that brings us to these. Does anybody know who is the creator of these fantastical structures?
It reminds me of the piece out in Hillsborough or whatever.
Yeah, and it might be from him. I'm gonna share again. This is Patrick Doherty, who's an artist whose work I really admire. And we're just gonna take a quick look at some of Patrick Doherty's work so we can be inspired also.
I don't get how this thing.
Just a quick tour of the creation of a willow sculpture by Patrick Doherty. Again, not living, but magical nonetheless.
For me, there's nothing more rewarding.
Excuse me, I'm gonna have to
Foraging the land, just walking around.
stop this. Go back to here. Show screen. Okay, and back to the slides. So, getting into a little bit more information about Willow. When I was looking into this, I mean, I knew a lot of this information, but humans have just a long and interesting history with this plant. It's been something that we've had a relationship with since, time immemorial, essentially, for our species. The genus for all willow is Salix, thought to be derived from Celtic sal, meaning near, and lis, meaning water. That tells you one of the main things that you need to know about willows, that willows love water. They love to grow around bodies of water, wetlands, riparian areas.
Here.
Some of our earliest known human artifacts were made with willow. Fishing nets, baskets, fish hooks, all kinds of different woven artifacts. Very few of which survive, but some, the evidence of them has been traced back to 8300 BC, so really long ago. The leaves and the bark of willow are mentioned in these ancient medicinal texts from several different ancient civilizations, and were used widely by different communities in Native America. The bark of willow has the compound salicin, which is basically the precursor to aspirin. It's from which aspirin is derived. And then I was reading about these really interesting associations with willow from different spiritual traditions. So willow is one of the 4 plants associated with the Jewish celebration of Sukkot. In Taoist lore, there's the idea of willow being a plant that is related to the ancestors and communicating with the ancestors. In Buddhist tradition, Kuan Yin is associated with the willow. In some Native American stories and old European storytelling as well, there's these figures of the grandfather willow. Again, an association of the willow with the ancestors, and a kind of both a portal to the ancestors, but also being something that is protective from evil spirits in a way. So there's a long, deep tradition that we have with this plant. This is the most majestic living willow structure I've ever seen. This is at a public park in Berlin. And you can see the many layers of willow all woven together. This kind of a structure is not done all at once. It's planted around that first course, and then over time it's grown and the new shoots are woven back in, and thereby the structure grows and becomes more complex. There's a lot of examples that we saw of willows around Berlin. We see these living willow walls, essentially like fences. There's a wonderful tradition of these in England as well, often called a fedge or a fence hedge, where you take willow boughs and weave them to make a barrier. Some other examples. Little willow hut. You can see this one is combining some of the living willow, which would be the vertical pieces, with the horizontal pieces that are not living, but they're there to reinforce the structure until the living stuff kind of becomes well established. This is a willow tunnel at a, can't remember where this playground site was that we visited, but it had just recently been planted and hadn't started to leaf out yet. This is a willow dome, also recently planted, just starting to produce its first greenery. So this was my first playground project that I ever did at the Evergreen State College Campus Children's Center, where I worked, and we planted willow just on the entrance to that slide you can see. We just planted the willow boughs and they started to branch out. So I really would like to go back there now. I don't know if that's even still there, but if it is, it's a huge tree at this point. And there's probably a slide just coming out of the base of it. Also on that site, we did the first living willow tunnel. This is the basic kind of weaving structure that I've used with all of my willow creations since, which is a combination of vertical, you might think of them as like posts that go straight up and down, and then the diagonal weavers in this kind of diamond pattern that reinforce and stiffen the whole structure. In this case, we did dig a trench to have because the soil was pretty well compacted, and then amended that soil with compost. I've also done it if the soil is not so compacted, you can literally just jam the willow bough right into the ground. This is that same willow tunnel the following year after they paved a path down the center of it, getting watered. And since that time, on almost all of the different playground projects I've been involved in have had some element of willow featured in them. And often this is a community built type activity. It's very forgiving material. It doesn't lend itself to perfectionism necessarily, but it does create magical little spaces that kids can get inside of. So here's a volunteer work party taking the willow boughs that have been planted and bending them over and tying them together with twine. This is that same willow tunnel the following year after it started to grow in. And this is the outside of that same willow tunnel after about 2 years without any trimming, which highlights the fact that if you want your cute little willow tunnel to stay in that state, it needs to be coppiced or trimmed back every year, which can be a wonderful thing because all of those new shoots can be used for other willow projects. They can be used for basket weaving and all sorts of different things. So it's very productive. But if left unabated, this will become a big, gnarly tree-like structure with a tunnel under it. Maybe that's great too. We do use twine to help reinforce the structures. This pictured is not actually what I think is best anymore. We've used it in the past, but what I prefer to use now is something more like jute that is naturally rot and fall away. This more synthetic string will eventually girdle the willow as it grows in those areas because it won't rot and fall away as easily. So lesson learned on that one. So here in the Northwest, we've got a variety of Northwest native willow to work with. that first willow structure that I did, and most of the ones that I've done have been using this top species, Schooler's willow, which is very abundant around here. And it's also the most drought tolerant of any of the willows. Willows love water. And so if you have a wet area of your yard, like that's a good place to put the willow. They will soak it up and maybe even help dry out if you have a puddled spot. But if you have a spot that's not so wet, then you want to choose something like a Schooler's willow. But I've also worked a little bit with Pacific willow and hooker willow, and they all have their different qualities. Sitka willow, aka pussy willow, with the wonderful fuzzy catkins. Schooler's willow also has fuzzy catkins. And willow is interesting. Like, so the reason that we can do these living willow structures is that willow has this kind of superpower to root from cuttings. Some other plants will do this as well, but willow is really prolific at it. So you take a cutting from willow and stick it in the ground, and roots will form. And that's because willow produces a natural rooting hormone inside of itself. In fact, if you take willow cuttings and put them in a bucket of water with other cuttings from other plants, those hormones will help that other plant to grow roots as well. Now, we do this primarily during the months of the year where there are no leaves on the willow, because those are the months that the plant is reserving its energy and putting any energy into growing roots rather than growing leaves and new vegetation. In the summertime, it's more preoccupied with spreading out and growing its leaves and sending up shoots, and it won't be as likely to root into a new location. So basically, anytime the leaves are off is a good time to plant willow from shoots. I don't have pictures of this, but I should mention willow is a wonderful plant for ecological restoration for that reason. And the willows that you see in those kinds of projects are often just like little stakes, like 12 inches long. And they'll literally like take those stakes with a big hammer and just drive them into the ground like little pins. And those pins will send off shoots and will root very quickly and retain area where there's likely to be soil erosion. So really disturbed, destroyed landscapes, willow is that first plant that comes in to provide a kind of bandage over that site and tie it together and hold it in. And so it uses its superpower to repair the landscape as well. I've experimented a little bit with some structures from other plants that can root from cutting. These are alder. They work to plant cuttings of just not quite as prolific as willow, but they do work. This is a structure created by my former Playscape playground mentor, Rusty, on a project in China, where they did a kind of metal framework for this dome and tunnel, and then interwove crepe myrtle vines through it. So this is a different kind of a living structure entirely. There's the crepe myrtle after it's leafed out a year later. So this is one of my favorite willow projects here in Portland at Zinger Farm. This started with a homeschool kids program at Zinger, where I talked to the kids and we brainstormed all these different ideas of projects that we can do in terms of natural play elements on the yard. And willow domes weren't the only thing that we came up with, but that was the one that people seemed to like the best. And this is one of the little sculptures that was made by the kids prior to that project. So we did our collaborative design. This is what the design that ended up coming out of that process. You can see that same weaving pattern that I told you before, where we have the vertical whips and the diagonal whips in a kind of diamond crisscross pattern. This is the site at Zinger. If anybody knows Zinger Farm, they have this wetlands area down below, and they had a bunch of willow trees already well established down there. So we took all of our cuttings from right there on site. And I don't actually even know what species of willow it is, but it was very well adapted to that area. So here's the first planting. Because this structure was so big, this is another, it was a multi-year process, and I need to go back and get some more recent pictures of it. But this was, the first planting, we take the thicker boughs, use them for the verticals, and the thinner ones become the diagonal weavers. And Brian actually came and helped me with this. Here was that first planting when it was completed, the tunnel, and then the big circular room. After that first year of growth, that year I came back and all of those long shoots that are sticking up got bent over and folded in to enclose the ceiling. And I couldn't find pictures of it all enclosed yet, but it's more of a cohesive structure now after several years of pruning and reweaving. That's the thing of cultivating a willow structure over time. When those new shoots get sent up, you can bend them back and weave them back into the structure to reinforce the structure and make it thicker. Or you can just start trimming them back entirely. Here's another local willow installation. This is up at Cedar Hills Preschool. This is using an English basket willow with the beautiful yellow stem. Tunnel shape. They were interested in the willow here because they had this area that all the runoff from their parking lot goes and used to just flood this whole area. So we created this rain garden, kind of wetland zone for the kids, but also used the willow to intercept and benefit from some of that water. So this is that willow tunnel. I think it was probably 2 years later, maybe 3 years later, again, without any kind of coppicing or cultivation. It's going to go kind of wild, and it did, but I think it still has a magical quality to it. We didn't mention yet some of the considerations and cautions around planting willow, and that's because it's such a prolific root grower and it loves water so much that those roots can spread out and are really good at finding water underground. So if there's underground water pipes, they're notorious for breaking into them. So the suggestion is to not plant your living willow structure within 20 feet of any underground water pipes or other utilities. This is a living willow installation up at the new nature play area of the Portland Zoo. Again, using this yellow English basket willow. I have a friend who cultivates this stuff for baskets, so I had a lot of access to it during this time. You start with the uprights for the dome, bend them over, tie them together, start cross weaving the diagonal pieces to reinforce and stiffen the structure. Again, all those places where we tied, that jute will fall away eventually, but by that point, the willow will have kind of fused together in the places where it's been pressed. And then eventually this will become essentially like one living plant. Again, a picture of that type of weave. So this is my most recent willow creation. This is at a children's museum up in Alaska. This is not a living willow structure. This is made using cut willows that are still pretty green, so they're still bendable. We created a metal framework in the shape of that circle, and then the willow boughs are interwoven between that metal, inside of that metal frame. It's exciting, kind of bringing the outside in kind of quality to this installation. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
I would love if you could share a little bit more about the actual procedure with that patterning. Like, when you're doing these diagonal weaves, I imagine there's an order of operations that's, you know, I can imagine there are some bad order of operations. I'm curious if you can share more on that piece.
Yeah. So I think that this one is a good illustration of the process. So in this place, this was an area that had native plants. There was a new clearing. The soil was still relatively soft, so we didn't have to dig. What we did was, I don't know if you can see down on the ground there, there's a hammer and a concrete stake. A concrete stake is like just a piece of steel bar with a little point on the end. And this is when the ground is not real rocky or compacted, you can do it this way. I hammer the stake in to make a little hole in the ground, pull the stake out, and then jam the willow in. You want it in the ground at least 12 inches or so. The more the better. I mean, they say for the best survival that you do like 1/3 of the total length of the willow. For these big structures, that's just not feasible to do that much, but the more the better in terms of as much willow in the ground as you can get. So you start with the verticals around the perimeter of whatever kind of structure creation that you're going to make. And then, you know, people have different ways that they do this. Some people would weave first before they try to enclose it on the top. In this case, I chose to tie over the verticals to create the overall roof shape of the dome first. And then starting with the diagonal weavers. So it's between every vertical one, there's 2 diagonals running in opposite directions. And there's actually like a lot of different weaving patterns out there. This is just happens to be the one that I'm familiar with and works, you know, has worked really well for me. But if you start looking at willow structures online, you'll see a bunch of different weaving patterns. So I would do that same method of hammering the stake in to get my hole, and inserting the willow bough, of course, with the butt end of it down, and feeding it through over and under along my diagonal. And not at every intersection, but maybe like the major intersections, maybe every third, I would tie with a little piece of jute twine. And that's kind of it.
Do you just go in a circle? Like,
yeah, I would start on one end with start on one side with like all the left-handed diagonals, and then I would go back around the circle in the other direction with all the right-handed diagonals. But you know,
gotcha.
if we had somebody on the line today who's has any experience with basket weaving, like they'll know a lot more about this than I do, because there can be some real high level technique involved with a complicated weave, and I'm not super experienced in that area, so I kind of muddle through it.
So I'm assuming that it's flexible enough that you're able to kind of bend it to get it back and forth at that stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for mentioning that. You want to weave it and plant it basically like as soon after it's harvested as you can, to keep it green. When I say green, that means it still has a lot of moisture in it, and it still remains very flexible. Now, different species of willow are more or less flexible than others. Like this English basket willow has been cultivated for its weavability over time. So it's very flexible. Whereas if I'm just harvesting willow out in the wild, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. You can keep it if you like have, you know, a couple weeks or even months between the time when you're harvesting it and you're planting it. You can keep it still flexible and green by wrapping it up in plastic and putting it in a cold, dark location so it doesn't dry out. Folks who cultivate willow for sale often will keep it in dark refrigerators. Yeah, the greener the better. And the structures are really resilient too. They retain their flexibility and you can go back and see, I mean, it's really obvious um, in a structure like this, you might have some percentage, maybe 15 to 30% of those willow whips that don't make it. They didn't survive the original transplanting, and that's okay. They won't undermine the structure. If you wanted to, you could go back and replace those with new green whips the following year, or just allow them to fall away naturally.
Are the diagonals about the same length as the verticals?
The verticals tend to be longer because I want them thicker, and so because the thicker ones would tend to be like to be longer as well. So a rule of thumb would be like the verticals are 2 to 3 years of growth, and the diagonals are like 1 to 2 years of growth. I wish I had pictures of harvesting the willow as well, but like this willow, I harvested off of my friend's backyard essentially, where he's cultivating it, and he coppices every year, which means he cuts off all of the new shoots of the willow basically back down to the ground. And the willow, the plant actually thrives by that process, and it sends up new shoots immediately. Not immediately, but within the next year, there'll be, it'll be fully verdant again, and those new shoots are often straight and nice, and that's why people coppice for basket willow production, whereas a willow out in the wild is going to have a lot more twists and nooks in it.
So
When
the
you
variety of willow is English basket willow?
Yeah, that's I don't know the scientific name of this particular willow. I know it as English basket willow.
Do you know any place local where we're able to find that to buy?
Yeah, I would be happy to share. I need to contact my friend to see if he's still cultivating. It's been several years since I sourced willow from him. But if people want to get in touch with me and I can make that connection, I'll put my info into the chat here. Another place where you can get willow locally is a nursery in West Lynn called Bosque Dell.
Oh,
They
yeah.
specialize in native plants, and they don't sell cuttings. They sell full willow bushes, which is, you can actually do a structure of full willow, just by planting it as you would plant any other shrub, in the formation of the base for the walls of your structure, and then you're pruning it back to the major kind of weavers and then weaving those together. There's that kind of a hut that I planted using that method. If you're driving down Killingsworth around like 57th, there's a big Lutheran church there, and they have a childcare program. And if you're headed east and you just quickly turn to the right and look, you'll see a willow hut in the middle of their playground. So Bosque Dell, Boskyddell, and they have all those varieties of native willow that I had on the slide earlier.
It looked like the diagonals were just woven in one direction for their whole length, rather than like going back and forth between the two verticals.
Right.
Is that correct? So they just go as long as they can in one direction?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, they're pretty flexible, but they're, the more times you bend it, the more likely it will snap, and some do snap. I'm looking in the chat. I just noticed in the chat here that there's some comments, and I want to attend to all these. So I'm just going to start at the top and work my way down. Do you know if they ever prune it? Some prune. It depends on what you want in the end. Like willows are a big genus, so there's a lot of plant species within that. Some of them will stay like smallish shrubs or medium-sized shrubs, let's say, and some will grow into humongous trees. And some of the willow cuttings for these structures, like I mentioned, if they hadn't been pruned at all, I imagine they're pretty big trees now with, woven kind of stem structures with the tunnel through the middle, which I think that's a cool effect as well. But some people want to keep them that kind of hedge shape, and then you need to prune more.
Yeah, my question was about pruning it when you were showing this structure that was in Germany, I think it was.
Mhm.
And I know that when we were in the Netherlands, that everybody trims they coppice all their trees.
Mhm.
And so I thought that structure there looked to me like one that was maintained like rigorously all
Absolutely.
the time to keep it, neat and very domesticated looking.
Yeah, and if you're talking about the multi-level structure,
Yeah.
yeah, that one absolutely was heavily maintained, and I'm sure that any of the new growth, they were either pruning it or tying it back in, binding it back to the rest of the structure. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Natural fibers yarn, that would be that would work as well. Would it be possible to start with a snow on the mountain salix as a back wall? Snow on the mountain salix, is that another common name for Schooler's willow? Because Schooler's willow is sometimes called mountain willow. So I think that would be great. I mean, as far as I know, there's a bunch of species of willow, like maybe over 400. And as far as I know, all of them will root from cuttings. So you can experiment with any species of willow to try to do something like this. They're going to have different qualities in terms of how bendy they are, how big they'll grow. Wisteria can be used in a way, like wisteria isn't, in my experience, isn't something that is as rigid in terms of its structure as a willow. So I've used wisteria a little bit, growing over like a trellis or something like that. So you need some kind of a framework to support it. I don't use wisteria in kids' environments because it's toxic berries. Japanese willows. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I've done stuff with curly willow. I really think that you could do almost any variety of willow. Is there a species that you prefer to build with? I think that it's more to do with the site. You want to choose the right willow for your location. And so, I've used native willows and non-native willows here, and they both do well. The biggest consideration with the site is, I think, how wet it is. And, I don't want to be in a situation where I have to provide irrigation for a living willow structure. So I'm going to try to choose, if I don't have a moist site, I'm going to try to choose the most drought tolerant willow, which leads me often to the Schooler's willow, which is our Northwest native drought tolerant willow. Is there such a thing as too wet? I'm not sure. I mean, I see willows growing literally in water. One of the ways that willow has propagated itself is that, the willow establishes itself in relation to river systems. And when those rivers flood, willow branches get snapped off. Some varieties of willow, actually, the branches break pretty easily, and those branches get snapped off and they get washed downstream, and then they might embed themselves in a bank somewhere downstream, and then they can root right from there. So they're also helping to, in the areas where that shifting river current of the river flood might wash away vegetation, the willow then comes in and revegetates and reties the soil back together again. So it's got this dynamic relationship.
What about red twig dogwood?
Yeah, I haven't experimented with it, but I've heard that you can also root red twig dogwood from cuttings. And I've heard that there are some folks doing that using this method that I mentioned earlier, where you would use a willow cutting as a companion for the red twig dogwood and soak the cuttings in a bucket together prior to planting them, so that the rooting hormone from the willow will stimulate the red twig dogwood. And I think you can also purchase rooting hormone. I've never done that before, but I think you can do that too, and that might help it to take. And again, you don't actually have to do a living structure from cuttings. Like it's kind of easy and fun to do from cuttings, but if you can actually, any kind of a plant you could plant in a shape of a structure and then prune it to make the walls, make the
Mhm.
the shape that you want it to have over time. And we've seen a lot of, interesting stuff with espaliered apple trees, or people shaping a tree to be a seat and all those kinds of things. And this is somewhat related to that too.
Are there any issues with planting some annuals, around the outside of the hut? I mean, just to have some more color in the summer or whatever, planting maybe sunflowers, that you could weave into the hut for the sunflower season, or anything like
Mm,
that? Have you ever
I don't
done anything like that, or do you think it would
know.
work?
I've never done them. Let's see. I've got a book. Um, that's a good question. I've never planted the sunflowers together with the willow, but when you mention the sunflowers, it reminds me of sunflower huts, which is something that I have done, where you plant the sunflowers as the wall of the structure, and that becomes those kind of vertical uprights, and then you plant like a climbing pea along with that kind of weaves up and interlaces with the sunflowers, and then they kind of fall in on each other. And but that's an annual living fort type of thing. But I'd love to see those kinds of experiments.
And is there any sort of a limiting factor on the diameter? I mean, how big is too big?
Yeah, I mean, just for logistics of being able to weave it, I think an inch is probably the biggest diameter.
No, I mean the structure itself,
Oh.
the diameter of the structure.
It just has to do with like how long term is your plan for enclosing it. If you actually want to enclose the roof,
Hmm.
that structure that I showed the picture of in Germany is the biggest one that I've ever seen, and that's like a multi-generational process.
Hmm.
My biggest one is that Zinger Farm spiral dome. It's a 16-foot diameter dome.
Okay, good.
And we were able to enclose that on the second year because we used some kind of largish original posts or uprights that were like 10 feet long or so to start. So it's not often easy to get whips that long, but because we were harvesting them on site there and we had a lot to choose from, we could get those nice and big ones. But even if you started small and you're willing to just continue weaving every year, I don't think there's any limit.
Okay, because we were thinking about like 15 to 20 feet in diameter.
Yeah, I would say start, and it's just going to be a circle with a wall around it, and then it's going to get a little bigger, and you'll weave it a little more, and then you might be able to enclose it on year 2 or 3.
Great, awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
About that big, and I think this is our 3rd year, and it's just getting around the time where I feel like I can get enough of them closing in on themselves. So it took 3 years.
I want to see pictures, Brian. So Brian started his backyard willow with cuttings from that Zinger willow the first year that we coppiced.
Yes, I was looking, but since it's winter, most of them are not super great right now. This is what it looked like. I don't know if you can see it. Might be too. This is when I had first planted it, probably the year after or so. And that's a little kiddie swimming pool in there. My daughter's swimming in there. But I think the only one I have right now, it just looks like a giant, untaken care of bush. I'll throw it up if I can. If I see it.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Like it's like a bush with a hole in the middle that you can get inside. So I think that's awesome.
I also wanted to share that Leanna's, and my dog enters the room. Hey, bud. that Leon's going to be helping us lead the Willow Dome installation in the Alder Commons backyard, so that we're going to be filming that and sharing that footage out, so we can send you all a short video. Oh, there's another great one, Brian.
Nice.
That's so neat. But Leon designs, playground structures and all sorts of really amazing things that you can buy on his store. And I popped it in the chat online. But also, if you know of a museum or a church or your local daycare center or wherever who wants to install these types of structures, we have an expert here. So, use his email and let's get more of these in the ground. They're so magical and they grow so well here. So neat.
Yeah, and just in conclusion there, I mean, I love the idea that we're in a lineage of this relationship with Willow that humans have had, across many different cultures for just thousands of generations, and that this plant, it offers us so much, and it also offers the earth so much in terms of its ability to be used in restoration projects. Its ability to tie the earth together when it's been disturbed. It's almost like a cicatrization or a scar forming process that heals damaged sites. And so I love that we can do something fun and whimsical and cool for kids that's also has it tied together to this lineage and also connected to a reparative process. I would love to consult with any school, especially local ones like in Battleground. So please get in touch with me. I put my email in there. I'm happy to chat. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here, and just huge thank you to Leon Smith for leading today. And we will be sharing out the recording as well as eventually some footage. The next week or two, we're going to get ours in the ground. So we'll share that out as hopefully a resource that'll be helpful for everyone. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, y'all.